When death gives you a second chance, you learn to recognize lies that once sounded like love. My name is Anna Wu, and in 1978, I was supposed to make the biggest mistake of my life, giving up my university acceptance letter to save a man who didn't deserve saving. But dying and coming back with the knowledge of what that sacrifice would cost me changed everything. In my previous life, I had believed every word when my fiancé Chen Wei begged me to sell my acceptance letter to his childhood friend Rose Liu. "Anna, you're brilliant. You can take the exam again next year," he had pleaded with tears in his eyes. "But Rose's family needs this opportunity now, and my mother is dying. If you do this for us, I promise to spend my whole life making it up to you." I had been young, naive, and desperately in love, so I gave up my dreams of studying literature at Beijing University, sold my acceptance letter, and married Chen Wei that autumn. What followed were 43 years of servitude disguised as marriage, watching Rose build the career that should have been mine while I raised children who would eventually choose their father's true love over their mother. But now, sitting in my childhood bedroom on the morning I received that acceptance letter, I had the power to change everything. The envelope felt heavy in my hands, heavier than it had the first time. Through the thin paper, I could see the official seal that had once represented everything I'd dreamed of becoming. This time, no amount of tears or manipulation would make me give it up. "Anna, Anna, where are you?" Chen Wei's voice drifted through the courtyard, urgent and desperate just as I remembered. In a few minutes, he would climb through my window, something he'd done countless times before, and begin the performance that had once convinced me to sacrifice my future for his lies. I quickly hid the letter under my mattress and positioned myself by the desk, pretending to read. The familiar sound of footsteps on the roof tiles made my heart race, but this time with anticipation rather than excitement. I was about to watch Chen Wei reveal his true nature much earlier than he had in my previous life. "Anna, thank goodness you're here," he gasped as he tumbled through the window, his face pale with what I now recognized as carefully practiced desperation. "I need to talk to you about something urgent." Chen Wei was handsome in the way that made village girls lose their senses, tall, with strong shoulders from his work at the county office, and dark eyes that could appear sincere when he needed something. In my past life, I had been completely enchanted by his attention. Now, I could see the calculation behind every expression. "What's wrong?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral despite the rage building inside me. "It's my mother," he said, sitting heavily on my bed exactly where I'd hidden the acceptance letter. "The doctors say she only has a few months left. She keeps asking about our wedding plans, about grandchildren. Anna, I can't bear the thought of her dying without seeing us married." The same lies, delivered with the same false emotion. I had to admire his consistency, even as I despised him for it. "That's terrible news about your mother," I said carefully. "But Chen Wei, I just received my university acceptance letter today. This is what we've been working toward for years." His eyes flickered with something cold before the mask of sorrow returned. "Anna, my love, don't you think there are more important things than books? My mother raised me alone after my father died. How can I let her down now when she's suffered so much? What does your mother's illness have to do with my education?" Chen Wei moved closer, reaching for my hands in the gesture that had once made my heart flutter. Now it just made my skin crawl. "Rose's family has offered to buy an acceptance letter for an enormous sum, enough to pay for the best medical treatment for my mother. They've been searching everywhere, but you're the only person in our county who received admission to a top university this year. So you want me to sell my letter to Rose?" "Not sell. Share your blessing with someone less fortunate. Anna, you're brilliant. You can retake the exam next year, maybe even get into an even better program. But this might be Rose's only chance, and it's definitely my mother's only chance at proper treatment." The manipulation was so smooth, so perfectly calibrated to appeal to my compassion and insecurity. In my previous life, I had been completely taken in. Now I could see every string he was pulling. "What about our future together?" I asked, testing him. "If I go to university, we'll be separated for years." "That's exactly why this works out so perfectly," Chen Wei said, his enthusiasm growing. "If you sell the letter to Rose, we can get married immediately. My mother can see our wedding before she passes, and we can start our family right away. Isn't that better than years of uncertainty? Years of uncertainty. What he meant was years of me becoming educated and independent, developing my own opinions and opportunities. A university-educated wife would be much harder to control than a village girl who'd sacrificed her dreams for love. Let me think about it, I said. Chun Wei's expression darkened slightly. Think about it? Anna, my mother might not have time for you to think about it. Besides, what's there to consider? I'm offering you everything: marriage, security, a chance to help the woman who raised the man you love. What could be more important than that? The pressure tactics were starting. This was the moment when, in my past life, I had crumbled under the weight of his expectations and my own desperate desire to please him. I need to discuss this with my father, I said instead. Your father? Chun Wei laughed, but there was no humor in it. Anna, your father respects my position at the county office. He knows that marrying me is the best opportunity you'll ever have. Do you really think he'd want you to throw that away for some uncertain dream of studying literature? He was right about my father's likely reaction, but I needed time to plan my next move. In my past life, I had made the decision too quickly, swept away by emotion and manipulation. This time I would be strategic. I understand your urgency, I said. But this is my entire future we're talking about. Surely you can give me one day to consider all the implications. Chun Wei stood up abruptly, his patience clearly running thin. One day? Anna, every day we wait is a day closer to my mother's death. How can you be so selfish? Selfish. The word he would use to manipulate me for the next 4 decades of my previous life. Every time I wanted something for myself, time to read, money for books, a moment to pursue my own interests, I was being selfish. I'll give you my answer tomorrow morning, I said firmly. Chun Wei stared at me for a long moment, and I saw something I'd never noticed before: genuine surprise. He hadn't expected resistance. In all his calculations, he'd assumed I would be easy to convince. Fine, he said coldly. But Anna, I hope you understand what you're risking. Rose's family won't wait forever, and neither will I. If you choose some fantasy over our real love, you might find yourself with nothing at all. After he left, I sat in the darkness planning my escape. In my previous life, I had given Chun Wei the letter the next morning and married him 2 weeks later. Rose had used my acceptance letter to attend Beijing University, where she'd studied chemistry and eventually become a respected researcher. Meanwhile, I had spent my life washing dishes, raising children, and watching my dreams crumble while Chun Wei carried on his affair with Rose for decades. But I had advantages now that I hadn't possessed before. I knew Chun Wei's true nature, I knew Rose's family situation, and most importantly, I knew that Chun Wei's mother wasn't actually dying. That entire story was fabricated to manipulate me into giving up my education. His mother would live for another 28 years, during which she would treat me with nothing but contempt for being an uneducated peasant girl who had trapped her son into marriage. The next morning, I woke early and made my preparations. First, I wrote a detailed letter to the university admissions office, explaining that I was concerned about potential fraud involving my acceptance letter and requesting additional security measures to verify my enrollment. Then I visited my neighbor Mrs. Chun, an elderly woman who had always been kind to me. Auntie, I said, I need your help with something important. Mrs. Chun had been a teacher before retiring, and she understood immediately when I explained the situation. That boy has always been too smooth for his own good, she said, shaking her head. His mother came by yesterday bragging about how rich they'll be once Rose's family pays for your acceptance letter. Dying my foot, she's never been healthier. The confirmation of what I already knew still made my blood boil. Mrs. Chun agreed to be my witness and help me document everything that happened next. When Chun Wei arrived at my house that morning, he found me waiting in the courtyard with my father, Mrs. Chun, and my acceptance letter in a sealed envelope. Anna, I'm so glad you've come to your senses, he said, reaching for the envelope with greedy hands. Rose's family is waiting, and we can start planning our wedding immediately. I've made my decision, I said clearly, and my decision is no. Chun Wei's confident expression froze. No. What do you mean no? I mean I'm keeping my acceptance letter and going to university. I won't be selling it to Rose, and I won't be marrying you this year. The transformation in Chun Wei's face was remarkable. The mask of gentle devotion fell away completely, replaced by cold fury. Anna, you're making a huge mistake. Do you think any other man will want you after you've dishonored our engagement? Do you think you can survive in Beijing alone with no family, no money, no connections? I'll manage, I said. You'll manage? Chun Wei laughed harshly. Anna, you're a village girl with no experience of the world. You'll be eaten alive in the city. Come crawling back here in 6 months, and maybe I'll still be willing to marry you. My father shifted uncomfortably beside me. I could see him wavering, influenced by Chun Wei's confident words and social position. Anna, my father said quietly, perhaps you should reconsider. Chun Wei has a good job, and marriage provides security that education cannot guarantee. Before I could respond, Chun Wei pressed his advantage. Uncle Wu, you're a wise man. You understand that a woman needs a husband's protection. What will Anna do with a literature degree? Become a teacher earning peasant wages? I'm offering her a comfortable life as the wife of a county official. What if I fail? I asked suddenly. What if I go to university and can't handle the coursework? What if I graduate and can't find a job? Chun Wei's eyes lit up, thinking he'd found my weakness. Exactly. Why take such risks when I'm offering you certainty? But what if I succeed? I continued. What if I become a professor, or a writer, or a translator? What if I discover I'm capable of things I never imagined? Anna, don't be ridiculous. What if the only thing holding me back from greatness is the fear of disappointing a man who's lying to me about his mother being sick? Dead silence fell over the courtyard. Chun Wei's face went white. What did you say? He whispered. I turned to Mrs. Chun. Auntie, didn't you see Chun Wei's mother yesterday? How did she look? Mrs. Chun spoke clearly. Healthy as a horse. She was carrying 2 heavy buckets of water from the well, and bragging about the money they'd make from selling Anna's education to that Rose girl. Chun Wei's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. You don't understand. I understand perfectly, I said. You've been lying to manipulate me into giving up my dreams, so your girlfriend Rose can have them instead. Rose isn't my girlfriend. The protest came too quickly, too desperately. Mrs. Chun cackled. Boy, half the village has seen you sneaking around with that Lu girl after dark. You think people are blind? My father's expression was hardening as he absorbed this information. Chun Wei realized his position was becoming precarious. Anna, even if you don't believe me about my mother, think about our future together. I love you. You love what I can give up for you. I corrected. You love having a wife who's grateful enough to never question your choices. You love the idea of Rose having my education while I spend my life washing your clothes and raising your children. Chun Wei's desperation was becoming ugly. Fine. You want to go to university? Go. But don't expect me to wait for you. Don't expect any man to want a woman who chooses books over family. You'll end up alone and regretful. And when you come back begging for forgiveness, I won't be here. Promise. The word slipped out before I could stop it, and Mrs. Chun burst into delighted laughter. Even my father cracked a small smile. Chun Wei's face turned red with humiliation. You'll regret this, Anna Wu. Mark my words, you'll regret choosing pride over love. The only thing I regret, I said, is wasting 3 years thinking you were worth my affection. After Chun Wei stormed off, my father remained quiet for a long time. Finally he spoke. Anna, are you certain about this path? University is expensive and you'll be far from home. Father, I've never been more certain of anything in my life. He nodded slowly. Then we'll find a way to make it work. Your mother always said you had the brightest mind in the family. Maybe it's time to see how bright. The weeks that followed were challenging but exhilarating. News of my refusal to sell my acceptance letter spread quickly through the village, generating mixed reactions. Some people, especially older women who had sacrificed their own educations for family obligations, supported my choice quietly. Others, particularly those connected to Rose's family, criticized me openly for being selfish and ungrateful. Rose herself confronted me 3 days later, appearing at my door with tears streaming down her face. Anna, please reconsider, she begged. My family has already promised Chun Wei's family the money. If I can't go to university, my parents will lose face in front of the entire county. I looked at Rose, really looked at her, for the first time without the filter of my previous life's resentment. She was beautiful, well-dressed, and clearly accustomed to getting what she wanted through a combination of charm and emotional manipulation. In many ways, she and Chunwei deserved each other. Rose, you're 18 years old and intelligent, I said. If you want to go to university, take the entrance exam yourself next year. But I'm not smart enough to pass on my own. Everyone knows you're the only one who could get into Beijing University from our area. Then maybe you should study harder instead of trying to buy someone else's achievements. Rose's tears dried up instantly, replaced by cold anger. You think you're so special, don't you? You think being book smart makes you better than everyone else. I think working for what you want makes you better than stealing it from someone else. You'll regret this, Rose said, echoing Chunwei's threat. Chunwei will marry me instead, and we'll both be more successful than you ever dreamed of being. Then everyone gets what they deserve, I replied. As my departure date approached, I began receiving anonymous letters warning me about the dangers of leaving the village. Someone threw rocks at our house one night. My father's boss at the grain distribution office suggested that my unfilial behavior might affect his position. The pressure campaign was clearly orchestrated by Rose's family, who held significant political influence in the county. They were determined to force me to change my mind through intimidation. Instead of backing down, I decided to accelerate my plans. I wrote to my aunt in Beijing, my mother's sister who had married a factory worker and moved to the city 20 years earlier. Though we'd had little contact, she responded immediately with an offer to help me find part-time work and a place to stay during my studies. The night before my departure, Chunwei made one final attempt to change my mind. He appeared at my window again, but this time his approach was different. Anna, I owe you an apology, he said, his voice soft and contrite. I've been selfish and manipulative. You were right to refuse me. I watched him carefully, wondering what new strategy he was employing. I've been thinking about everything you said, he continued. And I realize now that I was asking you to sacrifice too much. If you truly want to go to university, I'll support your decision. That's generous of you, I said neutrally. More than that, I want to wait for you. 4 years isn't so long, and when you graduate, we can build a life together as equals. You'll have your education, and I'll have proven my devotion by waiting. It was a good speech, delivered with apparent sincerity. In my previous life, such words might have swayed me. Now they only confirmed how manipulative Chunwei truly was. What about Rose? I asked. What about her? Anna, you're the woman I love. Rose was just a mistake. A moment of weakness that I deeply regret. And your mother's illness? Chunwei had the grace to look ashamed. I exaggerated the situation. She's fine and I'm sorry I lied to you. I see. I pretended to consider his offer. Chunwei, it's kind of you to offer to wait for me. But I have to ask, if you're willing to wait 4 years now, why were you so urgent about marriage before? I was afraid of losing you, he said quickly. I thought if you went away, you might find someone better and forget about me. And now you're not afraid? Now I trust in our love. I smiled at him, and for a moment, hope flickered in his eyes. Chunwei, you're absolutely right about one thing. I will find someone better. In fact, I already have. His face went blank with confusion. What? I've found myself. And compared to the woman I am when I'm not trying to please you, you're nothing special at all. The mask slipped again, revealing the anger beneath. Anna, you're making the biggest mistake of your life. You think education will make you happy? You think some career will keep you warm at night? You're throwing away real love for an impossible dream. I'm throwing away a comfortable prison for a chance at freedom. Chunwei stood up, his fists clenched. You'll be back. Women like you always come back when reality hits. And when you do, I won't be here. I'm counting on it. I left for Beijing the next morning on a bus filled with other young people heading to various universities. As the village disappeared behind us, I felt a lightness I'd never experienced in my previous life. For the first time in over 60 years, counting both lifetimes, I was making choices based on my own desires rather than other people's expectations. University life was everything I'd dreamed it would be and more challenging than I'd anticipated. My literature courses opened up new worlds of thought and expression. I struggled with English at first but gradually improved. I made friends with other young women who shared my love of learning and my determination to build independent lives. Most importantly, I began to understand who I truly was when I wasn't constantly trying to accommodate someone else's needs and expectations. 6 months into my first year, I received a letter from Mrs. Chun updating me on village news. Chun Wei had indeed married Rose in a lavish ceremony paid for by her family. However, their happiness was short-lived. Rose had failed the university entrance exam twice and was growing bitter about her situation. Chun Wei had been caught embezzling money from the county office and demoted to a clerk position. Their marriage was already showing signs of strain. They deserve each other, Mrs. Chun wrote. But it's sad to watch two selfish people discover that selfishness doesn't create happiness. I felt no satisfaction in their misfortune, only relief that I had escaped that fate. My second year brought new challenges and opportunities. I was selected for a competitive exchange program with a university in Shanghai, where I would spend a semester studying comparative literature. The program would provide valuable experience, but required excellent grades and a recommendation from my professors. I threw myself into my studies with renewed determination, earning the highest marks in several courses. My literature professor, Dr. Wang, called me into her office to discuss my future plans. "Anna, your essays show real insight and original thinking," she said. "Have you considered pursuing graduate studies after your degree?" Graduate studies. The possibility had never occurred to me. In my previous life, I'd barely finished primary school. With your analytical skills and passion for literature, you could contribute significantly to the field. There are opportunities for research, teaching, even studying abroad. The world seemed to expand around me as Dr. Wang outlined various possibilities. I could become a professor myself, conducting research and mentoring other young women. I could work as a translator, bringing foreign literature to Chinese readers. I could even write my own books, contributing to the literary tradition I'd spent my life admiring from a distance. "I'd like to learn more about these opportunities," I said. "Excellent. I'll arrange for you to meet with some of my colleagues who can provide guidance." That evening, I sat in my dormitory room writing a letter to my father, trying to explain the new horizons opening before me. In my previous life, I had spent decades wondering what I might have accomplished if I'd had the chance to develop my potential. Now I was discovering that my potential was greater than I'd ever dared imagine. My third year brought romance, but of a completely different nature than my relationship with Chun Wei. Lu Jiaming was a philosophy student from Shanghai, thoughtful and well-read, who treated my opinions as valuable and my ambitions as worthy of respect. When I told him about my plans for graduate school, he didn't question whether such goals were appropriate for a woman. Instead, he asked thoughtful questions about my research interests and offered to help me practice my presentations. "You have an unusual way of seeing literature," he told me after I'd shared my analysis of a complex poem. "You find connections that others miss." "I think it's because I understand what it feels like to have your story told by someone else," I replied. "I'm interested in whose voices get heard and whose get silenced." Jiaming nodded seriously. "That's important work. The stories we tell shape how we see the world." Our relationship developed slowly, built on intellectual compatibility and genuine friendship rather than passion and possessiveness. Jiaming never tried to change my plans to accommodate his, and I never felt the need to diminish myself to make him feel important. It was the kind of partnership I'd never known was possible. In my fourth year, I received another letter from the village. This time, the news was grimmer. Chun Wei and Rose's marriage had completely collapsed. Rose had become involved with a married professor in the county seat, causing a scandal that resulted in Chun Wei losing his remaining government position. He was now working as a laborer, bitter and drinking heavily. Rose had disappeared entirely, supposedly fleeing to Guangzhou to escape the gossip. "People ask about you sometimes," Mrs. Chun wrote. "They want to know if you're happy with your choice. I tell them you're flourishing like a flower that finally found the right soil." I was indeed flourishing. I had been accepted into a master's program in comparative literature, with a focus on women's voices in traditional Chinese poetry. My thesis advisor was a brilliant woman who had studied at universities in both China and England, and she became both a mentor and a role model. Anna, you have the potential to contribute something significant to our understanding of literary history, she told me during one of our regular meetings. But remember that academic success alone isn't enough. Use your education to lift up others who haven't had your opportunities. Her words resonated deeply with me. I began volunteering to tutor young women from rural backgrounds who were struggling with the transition to university life. Many of them faced the same pressures I had encountered. Families who questioned the value of female education, boyfriends who wanted them to prioritize romance over studies, and their own internalized doubts about their capabilities. My fiancé says I should drop out and marry him before I get too educated to be a good wife, one of my tutees confided during a session. He says men don't like women who think too much. What do you think about that? I asked her. I think he's afraid I'll discover I'm smarter than he is, she replied with a small smile. Then you already know everything you need to know about that relationship. As my master's degree neared completion, I faced another choice point. I had been offered a teaching position at a university in Beijing, as well as an opportunity to pursue doctoral studies abroad. Both paths would take me further from the village where I'd been born, deeper into a world that would have been completely foreign to the woman I'd been in my previous life. I chose the doctoral program. The decision meant leaving China for the first time, spending 3 years at a university in England studying the intersection of literature and social change. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. My father, now in his 60s, came to Beijing to see me off at the airport. We had both changed dramatically since that morning when I'd refused to sell my acceptance letter. He had retired from his job at the grain office and was spending his time reading books I sent him, developing his own love of learning. Anna, I want you to know how proud I am, he said as we waited for my boarding announcement. When you were young, I thought security was the most important thing I could give you. Now I understand that courage is worth more than comfort. You gave me both, I replied. You supported my choice when it mattered most. I'm glad I lived long enough to see who you became. The years abroad were transformative. I studied with scholars from around the world, learned to see my own culture from new perspectives, and developed research that would eventually become my doctoral dissertation on the evolution of women's literary voices during periods of social upheaval. More importantly, I learned that the confidence I'd gained by refusing to compromise my dreams was not just personal strength. It was a foundation for understanding how literature could inspire social change. My research focused on writers who had used their words to challenge social limitations, and I began to see my own story as part of a larger narrative about women claiming their voices. When I returned to China with my doctorate, I was offered a position as a professor at Beijing University, the same institution where I would have studied if I'd kept my original acceptance letter. The irony was not lost on me. My inaugural lecture was on the topic of lost voices, recovering women's stories from traditional literature. The auditorium was packed with students, colleagues, and visitors from around the academic community. As I looked out at the audience, I saw young women whose faces reminded me of my own at 18, bright, ambitious, but uncertain whether their dreams were achievable. Every story we don't tell, I began, becomes a limitation we accept. Every voice we silence becomes a future we surrender. The greatest tragedy is not failing to achieve our dreams, but failing to dream boldly enough to match our potential. After the lecture, a young woman approached me with familiar anxious energy. Professor Wu, I'm in a similar situation to one you mentioned in your research. My family wants me to leave university and get married, but I want to continue my studies. How do I know if I'm making the right choice? I smiled at her, remembering my own desperate uncertainty 4 decades earlier. The right choice is the one that honors who you're becoming, not who others want you to remain. Don't let anyone convince you that your dreams are less important than their comfort. Years passed. I published books, mentored countless students, and traveled the world presenting my research. Jiaming and I had married after my return from England, building a partnership based on mutual respect and shared intellectual passions. We had 2 children, a daughter who became a doctor and a son who chose to be a teacher, both of whom grew up understanding that their mother's work was as important as their father's. I never saw Chen Wei again, though I occasionally heard updates through Mrs. Chen's letters. He had remarried a much younger woman who left him within 2 years. His drinking had worsened, and he was known throughout the county as a bitter man who blamed his failures on the women who had betrayed him. Rose had eventually returned from Guangzhou, divorced and struggling to support herself with various jobs, still beautiful but worn down by years of poor choices. On my 60th birthday, my daughter organized a celebration that brought together colleagues, former students, and friends from various stages of my life. As I listened to their speeches about my contributions to literature and education, I thought about the parallel life I had lived, the one where I had given up my dreams to make Chen Wei and Rose happy. In that life, I would have spent this birthday washing dishes after a family dinner, invisible and unacknowledged, my potential buried under decades of compromise. My children would have grown up seeing their mother as a cautionary tale, rather than an inspiration. My mind would have been filled with regret rather than satisfaction. Professor Wu, one of my former students, said during the celebration, "You've always taught us that literature has the power to change lives. How has your own story shaped your understanding of that power?" I thought about her question carefully before responding. I learned that the most important story you'll ever tell is the one you tell about yourself to yourself. If you accept someone else's narrative about your limitations, you'll live within those boundaries. But if you insist on writing your own story, you'll discover that your potential is far greater than anyone else's imagination. Later that evening, as Jemming and I sat in our study surrounded by books from around the world, I pulled out a letter I'd never sent, one I'd written to Chen Wei years earlier but never mailed. "What's that?" Jemming asked. Something I thought I needed to say, but realized I didn't. I tore the letter into small pieces and threw them away. Chen Wei had already received the only message that mattered. My success was the greatest revenge against his attempt to limit my life. As I approached retirement, I began working on my memoirs, not just an academic autobiography, but a story about the power of choice and the courage required to claim your own life. I wanted to write for all the young women who were facing their own versions of my crossroads, dealing with people who would try to convince them that love meant sacrifice, and that dreams were less important than security. The title came to me during a conversation with my granddaughter, who was preparing for her own university entrance exams. "Grandmother, were you ever afraid you made the wrong choice?" she asked. "When you gave up that engagement to go to school?" "I was terrified," I admitted, "but I was more afraid of living with the regret of not trying." "How did you know it would work out?" "I didn't. But I knew that even if I failed, I would fail while pursuing something I believed in rather than succeeding at something that made me unhappy." That night, I wrote the opening lines of my memoir. When death gives you a second chance, you learn to recognize lies that once sounded like love. This is the story of how I discovered that the greatest risk is not following your dreams, but settling for someone else's vision of your life. The book was published to modest academic interest, but unexpected popular acclaim. It struck a chord with women across generations who had faced similar choices, or were still facing them. I received letters from readers around the world, sharing their own stories of resistance and transformation. One letter stood out among the rest. It was from a young woman in my home county who had read my book and recognized the village I'd described. "Professor Wu," she wrote, "I think I know the man you wrote about. He still lives here, though he's very different now, sick and alone, with no one to care for him. He saw your book in the county library and became very agitated, claiming you had ruined his reputation with lies. But everyone here knows the truth. They remember how you left for university, and how your choice inspired other girls to fight for their education too. You probably don't know this, but there's a scholarship at the county high school named after you now. It helps bright girls from poor families continue their studies. You changed more than just your own life. You changed the possibilities for an entire generation." I sat with that letter for a long time, feeling a deep sense of completion I hadn't expected. The ripple effects of my choice had extended far beyond my personal story, creating opportunities for young women I would never meet, but whose lives had been touched by my refusal to compromise. Chen Wei had been wrong about many things, but he had been right about one. My choice to prioritize education over his version of love had indeed changed everything. It had changed my life, my family's future, and the options available to countless other women who had seen that it was possible to say no to limitations disguised as love. The last chapter of my memoir was titled, What We Owe Our Future Selves. In it I wrote, "The woman I became could never have emerged if I had chosen security over possibility, comfort over growth, or someone else's approval over my own integrity. Every dream we abandon becomes a limitation we pass on to the next generation. Every time we choose courage over compliance, we expand the realm of what seems possible for those who come after us. I was given an extraordinary gift, the ability to see the consequences of my choices before making them. But even without that supernatural insight, we all have the tools we need to choose wisely. We have our intuition, which whispers warnings when something feels wrong. We have our dreams, which point us toward our authentic path. And we have our courage, which grows stronger every time we choose to honor our own truth rather than someone else's expectations." The young woman who received that acceptance letter in 1978 could never have imagined the life that lay before her. She was afraid, uncertain, and surrounded by people who insisted she was making a mistake. But she made a choice that honored her potential over their comfort. And that choice became the foundation for everything meaningful that followed. If you are facing a similar crossroads, remember this. The person trying to convince you to give up your dreams is never doing it for your benefit. They may believe they are, they may use the language of love and protection, but they are always asking you to become smaller, so they can remain comfortable. Your dreams are not negotiable. Your education is not optional. Your potential is not less important than someone else's insecurity. And your future self is counting on you to be brave enough to disappoint the people who would rather see you settle than soar. Choose yourself. Choose your growth. Choose your dreams. The world needs what you have to offer, but only you can decide whether to give it. On the last day of my teaching career, 45 years after I first stood in a university classroom as a nervous undergraduate, I delivered my final lecture to a packed auditorium. The topic was the stories we tell ourselves. And I concluded with the same message I had been sharing in various forms throughout my career. You are the author of your own life story. Write it as if the world is watching, because it is. Write it as if future generations are depending on your courage, because they are. And write it as if your dreams matter as much as anyone else's, because they do. As I packed up my office that evening, removing books and papers that represented decades of scholarship and teaching, I found an old photograph tucked inside one of my research notebooks. It was a picture from my university graduation, showing a young woman in academic robes with eyes full of determination and possibility. I looked at that young woman, myself at 22, and felt a profound sense of gratitude. She had made the choices that allowed me to become everything I had dreamed of being. She had faced down pressure, manipulation, and threats to claim a life that seemed impossible at the time. "Thank you," I whispered to the photograph. "Thank you for being brave enough to disappoint the people who wanted you to stay small. Thank you for choosing growth over comfort, possibility over security, and dreams over the easy path. Because of your courage, I got to live a life worth living." I placed the photograph in my briefcase and walked out of my office for the last time, carrying with me the satisfaction of a story well told and a life fully lived. Behind me, I left a legacy of young minds inspired to claim their own voices and write their own stories with the same courage that had transformed a village girl into a scholar whose words would outlive her. The acceptance letter that had started it all was now framed in my study at home, not as a memento of academic achievement, but as a reminder of the moment when I chose to become myself rather than the person others wanted me to be. It represented the first step in a journey that had taken me farther than I ever imagined possible. Not just geographically, but into depths of potential I never knew I possessed. Sometimes courage looks like a grand gesture, but more often it looks like a quiet refusal to accept limitations that feel wrong. It looks like a young woman saying no to pressure and yes to possibility. It looks like choosing the unknown over the insufficient, even when everyone around you insists you're making a mistake. In my 2 lifetimes, I learned that the biggest risk is not failure, It's settling for a life smaller than your potential. And the greatest victory is not achieving every dream, but having the courage to pursue them with your whole heart. Chun Wei had been wrong about everything that mattered. My education didn't make me unmarriageable, it made me selective. My dreams didn't make me selfish. They made me generous enough to inspire others. My refusal to compromise didn't ruin my life. It was the foundation for a life beyond my wildest imagination. And in the end, that made all the difference.